Welcome back, everybody. In this topic, we're going to take a quick overview of configuring MAB authentication in the network, and we're going to see what are the required steps to do that on the switch side and on the radio side, and we're going to use ISE for that option. So first of all, in order to make the integration between the switch and the ISE, we need to enable a new model, and then we're going to go to configuring the radio settings on the switch side. Then we need to globally enable the authentication on the switch. Even though we are using MAB and not .1x, the command that governs the switch level, switch wide authentication for all the ports is AA authentication .1x. So again, even that if we use MAB, we still need to enable this. We basically need to globally enable authentication on the switch. Then we'll go to the port level and basically enable MAB and also enable authentication. We're going to go to some optional settings that are available to us, and then finally we're going to go to the configuration on the ISE side to match the switch configuration. If we look at the diagram, so to see what are the processes we're going to go through, I'm going to take R2 as the client. So this would be the client that I want to authenticate in the network, and which is connected to switch 1. So switch 1 will be the authenticator, which will speak radius with ISE. So ISE will speak radius with switch 1, and ISE will be the authentication server. Because I'm using MAB, there will be basically no communication, no exchange between the client and the switch. Just the switch will take the MAC address and try to authenticate it against ISE through radius. So first, let's go on the switch side, on switch 1, and globally enable. So I want to say conft AA new model to globally enable AA, and then I want to say AA group AAA group server, let's say ISE radius, and then so AA group server radius, ISE radius, and then I'm going to say server private, and the IP address which was going to be 172.16.1.100, and I'm going to use the key of Cisco. I'm also going to use the radius source interface of loopback 0. This is optional, and as I said, I'm now going to globally enable AA authentication .1x, which I'm going to use the default method and with a group of ISE radius. So I cannot use a named authentication list for .1x. I need to use the default authentication list for that. Now, before I go on the port level, so let's say show CDP neighbors. I see that R2 is connected on switch ports FA102. So before I configure anything on the port side to basically enable authentication, so I don't get any errors on the switch, let's say show MAC address table dynamic interface FA10T, because I will want to add the MAC address of the client into ISE database. Now, it's also important to see what happens before the client is authenticated and after. At this moment, the switch learned the MAC address as a dynamic, so it's a dynamically learned MAC address. What we're going to see is that once the client is authenticated through MAB or .1x, doesn't matter, that MAC address will become static. The reason why that happens is that once you enable authentication on the port level, basically the switch enforces some kind of port security, and we're going to go in more detail about this functionality. Now let's go on ISE. So let's log in ACS admin and default 1A. So now the first thing I want to do is I want to add switch 1 as a network access device into ISE. So I go to administration, network devices, and I have here the same functionality as in ACS, meaning that I can either use something which is called the default device, or I can either manually and specifically add switch 1 as a device into ISE database. Now, the scope of using the default device would be that in a big setup and implementation, for example, when you need to add into ISE database like hundreds or thousands of routers, switches, or LAN controllers, then instead of doing that, you can make use of the default device. So basically, ISE, when it receives an inbound radius request from a network device, it will first look in the network devices section. If it specifically finds the device in there, it will try to authenticate based on the pre-share key which is configured in there. Otherwise, it will fall back on the default device. I'm going to specifically add it, so I go to network devices and I say add. And the name would be switch 1. I'm going to give it the IP address of 150.1.9.9, which matches the loopback 0 on switch configuration. Authentication settings, I said that the shared key was Cisco. I can do a show to make sure I typed in correctly, which I did. I say OK and submit. The next step would be to add the router's MAC address into ISE's internal endpoint store. So I go to identities, endpoints, and I say add. And I need to add here the MAC address of the client. So let's go back on switch 1, and I said this is D867. So I need to type D8:67 : this would be D9E0BBC0. So D9E0BBC0. And I'm going to say submit. I'm not yet concerned at this moment for the policy assignment or for the identity group assignments. These are used for profiling, which we're going to talk about in a later topic. So I'm going to say just submit for the moment. And then we'll go to policy authentication. Let's see if we can make use of the default authentication policies that are available to us in ISE. So I want to use a MAB type of authentication, which is this one. The name is MAB, and then the condition set is wired MAB. I want to go ahead and verify that I can use that condition set. So I say policy conditions. I go to authentication conditions, compound conditions, and then that was wired MAB, which says that I need to match on a service type of call check, which is used by MAB indeed, and on a NAS port type of Ethernet, which means that the client is connected on an Ethernet port, not on a wireless port. So I go back on the authentication. So far is good. And then the authentication rule says that if the condition is met, I will try and authenticate the session, the user, by using any protocols which are in the default network allowed protocol list. By default, that list pretty much allows all protocols. Let's go to results, to authentication, allowed protocols, and the default network access. So this allows process host lookup, EAP, EAP-TLS, PEEP, also allows EAP fast. Let's go and create our own list, and let's make it available for only MAB. So I'm going to go to allow protocols. And I'm going to say add to create my own list. I'm going to call it MAB. And basically, I'm going to disable all the functions of disable PAP, disable EAP-MD5, disable EAP-TLS, PEEP, and also EAP fast. So this is it. Now for MAB to work, as we speak in the MAB versus Data1X introduction, I can either do the authentication based on the calling station ID, which that means I need to add the MAC address of the client in the ISE endpoint store, or I can do the authentication based on a username password type of authentication, which means I will need to go into ISE internal user store and add the username being the MAC address and the password being the MAC address. Now this option in here, which is process host lookup, means that I'm going to do the MAB authentication based on the calling station ID value, which is the MAC address. So for the moment, I'm going to use just this one. And I will say submit. And now I need to go to my authentication policy and change the allowed protocol list. So in here, I want to say that I'll use the MAB list. So far I say that if the inbound authentication request is wired MAB, which it is, I will allow the session to be authenticated only by process host lookup mechanism, which is good. And then I'm going to authenticate the session against the internal endpoints where I added the MAC address of the client, which is R2. So I'm going to go ahead and say save. At this moment, I don't want to do any kind of authorization. I just want to do the authentication. So by looking at the authorization policy, as we know, I still need to match on authorization rule. So even if I pass authentication, I don't want to return any authorization attributes back to the authenticator, which is the switch, like an access list or a VLAN. I still need to match on authorization policy, which in my case, I'm going to use the default one, which basically says permit access. Permit access means that ISE will send back to the switch just an access accept message if the client successfully authenticated. So at this moment, my config should be good on the ISE side. I'm going to go on switch, and I'm going to enable MAB on the interface towards the client. To do this, I need to specify interface FA102, and then I need to say MAB. And additionally, I need to enable the authentication. Now, if I do question mark, by default, this is in force unauthorized mode, which force unauthorized means that the switch does not request the client to be authenticated. So whatever device is connected to this port, it will not be asked for authentication. The other two options would be force authorized, which means that the client is authenticated at all times. What I want to do is I want to say auto, which auto means I will try and authenticate the client, and I want to authenticate the client. So I'm going to say auto. At this moment, the port was bounced, and I should see, which I already see, authentication result success from MAB for client. So now if I do show MAC address table, dynamic, interface FA102, I see nothing in here because, as I said, once the client is authenticated, the MAC address is changed from dynamic to static. So what I want to do is, let's say, show MAC address table, interface FA102, and now I see that the MAC address of the client is of type static. To verify the authentication, you have the show authentication session command, which tells me that whatever interfaces are configured for authentication, which in my case is only FA102, and I'm using the MAB method to authenticate the client, and authorization is success. We'll go to, in further details, what the data domain means exactly, and also about the session ID in other topics. I can also see the details about the authentication by doing show authentication sessions, interface FA102, and I can see the MAC address of the client and the username, which is the MAC address because I'm not using that 1X. And I can see that the status is authorization success. And I also can see that it was authorized by the authentication server. Because as we're going to see in further videos, I can optionally authorize the client locally in case I cannot communicate with the authentication server, which is ISE in my case. And I also see that the authentication was successful using the MAB method. You also have one command, which is show MAB all, I think, which shows you the interfaces for which MAB is enabled. So I have MAB enabled only on FA102. Let's go on ISE side and to verify the logs. So we'll go to Operations, Authentications. And I see that the client was successfully authenticated. If I click on Details, let me refresh the page again. So let's click again on Details. So I have here a more detailed overview of the authentication process. So I see that authentication succeeded. I see the username, which this is basically the radius username attribute being the MAC address. And I see that I matched my allowed protocol list, which was called MAB, which this means that I matched the authentication policy that I've configured. So once you configure ISE with authentication policies and authorization policies, you want to look in the details of the authentication process to make sure that you match the proper authentication rule and authorization rule. So this confirms that I'm matching the MAB authentication policy, and having the authorization profile of permit access confirms that I'm matching the default authorization policy. And also that I'm doing the authentication based on a process host lookup mechanism. So now if I go back on policy authorization and I look at the applied authorization profiles, I see that only the default authorization policy uses a permission of permit access. If I would have matched, for example, the first authorization policy, which was called wireless blacklist default, I should see in the logs that the permission was called black hole wireless access, which in my case was named permit access. What I can do now is let's go ahead and let's say that I want to do the authentication not by using a process host lookup mechanism, but for example by doing a username password based authentication. So that would mean that I need to go in ISE internal user store and add the MAC address as the username and the password being the same as the MAC address. And I want to basically change the authentication result to not allow process host lookup to work. Because if I disable process host lookup, basically ISE will perform a regular username password based authentication. So let's first go on ISE and let's say administration, identities, and I will need to add the MAC address of the client in the user store. So I'm going to say add, and let me go back on the switch, and let's say show MAC address table, interface FA102, and I want to add this as a username. So D867, name, the username would be D867, followed by D9E0BBC0. So D9E0BBC0. D9E0BBC0. And the password will be the same value. I cannot copy paste from the username. So if I do Control-C, Control-V, it should probably not allow me to do that, which it doesn't. So I need to manually type in the password of being the MAC address. So D867, D9E0, BBC0, and then D867, D9E0, BBC0. And I'm going to say submit. The error message is received because ISE has a default password policy which does not allow me to put that simple the password. So I need to go to administration and settings. And I need to go to administration, settings should be in administration. Let's go again, settings. So that should be under user password policy. So what I want to do is I want to disable this, which says that the password cannot be the same value as the username. And I want to disable this, which says I need to have an uppercase character in the password. So this should allow me to put the password as being the MAC address. I go ahead and say save. And I go back into identities, users, I say add. I put the MAC address in here, and I specify it as a password, so D867, D9E0, and BBC0. Confirm D867, D9E0, and BBC0. And I say submit. So at this moment, ISE will still perform MAC address-based authentication because in the allowed protocol list, I specified to use the process host lookup mechanism. So I need to go and change that for the authentication method to be changed. I don't need to do any configuration changes on the switch side or on the authentication policies or on the authorization policies. So I go back on policy results. In the authentication, allowed protocols, and I'm going to edit the MAB. And I'm going to disable process host lookup, and I'm going to say allow PAP ASCII, which this is basically a plain based username password authentication, and say save. Now what I need to do is go on the switch side, and I need to reinforce the authentication process. So let's say show authentication sessions. So I'm going to say clear authentication session, session ID, this one. So I'm going to enforce the authentication to happen again. So clear authentication session, session ID. Now switch should force the authentication to happen again. So it said at this moment authorization failed for client. Let's go on ISE and watch the logs. So I'm going to say operations and then authentications. It says subject not found in applicable identity stores. So I'm having an authentication problem, not an authorization problem. I need to go to policy authentication, and I want to look where does ISE look into to authenticate the user. And I'm looking in the internal endpoints. This was correct when I was doing MAC-based authentication. So the ISE was looking at the calling station ID. Now I want to perform a username password-based authentication, which means I need to change this from the internal endpoints to the internal user store. So let's go ahead and modify this to internal users. And now let's say save. We need to wait for ISE to actually push the policy, so we'll give it a few seconds. And then I want to go back on the switch and say clear the session again. Let's say show authentication sessions, I should see that it failed. So I'm going to say clear authentication sessions, session ID, and this one, to basically force the authentication to be triggered again. So now I got an authentication successful result. So I see authentication result success from MAB. If I look on the show authentication sessions, it still says that it uses a MAB method. If I do show authentication sessions interface FA102, there is no difference on the authorization process. So I'm still saying that the authorization is success. It was received by the authentication server, and the MAC address is the same. So basically, from the switch side, there is no difference if ISE performs the authentication of MAB with the MAC address, which means the calling station ID, or username-based password authentication. So it's only a nice site of configuration to do that. Now if I go back and look on the ISE logs, so I say operations, authentications, I should see that the authentication was successfully applied, and I go to details. So if I go to details again, I see authentication succeeded, and I see that I matched the MAB authentication policy. I matched the authorization profile of permit access of the proper authorization policy, but this time the authentication protocol was PAP ASCII. So I'm doing a regular username password-based authentication. What I can also do, I can verify the MAB IP functionality if I want to do that. The main difference between doing MAB and MAB IP is that the service type is changed from call check to frame. Otherwise, the authentication process is the same. There is no communication between the client and the switch. So in order to make that functional, what I want to do is go on policy results, and I want to go to my authentication allowed protocols, which are MAB, and now I want to allow the MAB to work through IP type method, which means I need to specify allow IP MD5, and I can also optionally say detect IP MD5 as host lookup. What this means is that when I do MAB IP, I can have two options. Either I do a calling station ID based type of authentication, which means I need to check this detect IP MD5 as host lookup. Either I keep the username password based authentication, which means I'm going to do the authentication from the internal user store. So let's leave it as not detected as IP MD5. So I'm going to allow this protocol as well, and I'm going to say save. If I go on the switch side, and I'm going to say show authentication session, and I'm going to clear the session, clear authentication, session ID, this one. I see an authentication result success, but I forgot to change the MAB type. So let's go on FA102 and say interface FA102, and I'm going to say MAB IP, MAB IP. So let's say show authentication sessions and clear the session again, clear authentication sessions, session ID, this one. So I see authentication result success. If I go and I say show MAB all, I see that now I'm using a MAB IP method. If I scroll back and I look in the initial configuration, which was this one, so right at the top, which was in here, I was using a simple MAB method. Now I'm using the MAB IP method. But again, from the authentication perspective, nothing really changed. So if I do a show authentication sessions, I still see the same authentication results. And if I do show authentication sessions, interface FA102, I see authorization success and being authorized by the authentication server, and I use still MAB. If I go on ISE and I look in the authentication logs, and I click details, I see authentication succeeded. I see the authentication protocol being IP MD5. I see the authorization profile of being permit access, so I match the correct authorization profile. But in the allowed protocol, I see that I'm matching the default network access. The reason for that is that, as I said, MAB IP uses a service type of framed, not a service type of call check. So if we go back and look at our authentication policies, so policy authentication, the first rule says, has a condition of wired MAB, which, as we've seen previously, wired MAB says that the authentication needs to be of service type call check, and the NAS, it should be Ethernet type. So I'm not matching the first authentication policy because now I'm using a service type of framed, which the service type of framed is used in the wired.1x condition. So if we go to policy and conditions in the authentication, compound conditions, I want to go to wired.1x. I see in here that the service type is framed, but still the NAS port type remains Ethernet because this is a Ethernet type of .1x authentication. So there is not much of a difference between doing MAB IP or MAB. The main difference is on the ISE side to allow both IP MD5 or PAP ASCII in the protocol list. And depending on if you want to do either MAC-based authentication, that means you need to have process host lookup enabled. If you want to do username password-based authentication, then you need to disable the process host lookup functionality for both PAP ASCII and IP MD5, depending on what you have configured on the switch.